Well, from breast milk and fake breast milk to fathers.
To fathers.
Fathers.
Right.
Yeah. So again, like I said near the top of the hour, Father's Day is tomorrow, and yesterday we attended the graduation of Zachary, our firstborn and our producer, along with his 3 living grandparents, and it was quite a spectacle, and that and some previous things that we had been thinking about caused us to want to say a few things about fatherhood.
Okay. Yeah, I did actually have a serious point.
I know.
Moments ago, and it was about something. This has actually been troubling to me for a couple decades. There's a terminology we use out here in civilization that seems to me so upside down. And what it is when we say that somebody, is your biological father, right? What we mean is that they are your genetic father. But the problem, and you'll even hear this in courts, right? The discussion about custody and things, who is your biological father. But here's what is completely misunderstood about this. Human beings are, as we describe very thoroughly in our book, human beings are a very unusual species in which a huge fraction of what we are, and in fact almost all of the important stuff, is in the cognitive software layer, not in the hardware layer. And we have also described, and done so on the podcast many times, that human males have 2 reproductive strategies, or 2 broad categories. And we have described this variously as 3 versions. But let's just say you've got a demarcation between a high investment strategy in which males invest symmetrically to females in the raising of offspring, the protecting and providing for them. And then males also have other options which involve no investment in offspring. And the problem with the terminology about somebody's biological father is that it treats all of the stuff that fathers actually do, the stuff that matters most, as somehow secondary and lesser and unimportant, when in fact it is primary and every bit as biological. In other words, our genes create a brain that is inhabited by our I'm trying to avoid the term mind, but that's really what I mean here. Our minds develop inside our brains. The mind is what the brain does. And that mind is shaped by the exposure that a person has while developing, right? Somebody who provides the genes that become you, but doesn't stick around, doesn't inform you, is not an important part of your developmental environment, is your father in one way, but it is not the important way, right? The genes aren't that remarkable. They're not so different between one individual and another. What is remarkable, what's important, is what you become, and what you become is not preordained in the genetic layer. It is something that happens better when you have a father present, and it doesn't matter whether that father is your genetic parent or not. So, first thing to say is I really would love us to break the habit of referring to your genetic parent as your biological parent. Your biological parent is the person who raised you every bit as much as it is the person who provided the genes in question. It's great if they're the same person. Oftentimes, for many people, they are not the same person, and we should not be denigrating the role of somebody who has been your biological father in the cultural cognitive sense, but wasn't your genetic parent, because it really is the primary place where being a father is difficult and where the content of fatherhood matters.
Yeah, at some level, this is a place where the sexes are once again different, and this is asymmetrical with regard to a genetic mother, putting aside a few modern ways that can happen. A genetic mother has actually, by virtue of her being the genetic mother, and especially if she's going to continue to raise the child, put in a tremendous amount of resource and labor through gestation and lactation, right? Whereas the genetic father has only had to contribute sperm, and that was presumably quite a bit of fun and not much work, right? So the act of actually parenting, of mothering, or fathering, to turn it into the verb form, is by far the larger part of the work, and the more the more rewarding in many ways. It just goes on and on and on and on. But the genetic part of motherhood has already been a substantial investment, whereas the genetic part of fatherhood has not been. And so thinking about fatherhood as only the sperm, did you or did you not, minimizes tremendously what all fatherhood can be. As too would considering motherhood only to be the pregnancy and the lactation, the breastfeeding, would be to minimize all of what motherhood is. But that's already a big piece. Like that, the gestation and lactation are already providing a bond and a lifelong attachment that under almost all normal conditions then maintains forever. And one I think issue here, because we hear things like, you think the definition of woman is so simple, it's an adult human female, but definitions change all the time. Look at how we talk about an adoptive father being a father, and he's not a father. This is sort of where this is coming from, right?
Yep.
And I think you can't change language by diktat, or when people try, it usually backfires. But as much as the conversation right now around sex and gender is very confused by a lot of people, including some people who are trying to make it confused, and including by some people who are trying to make sense of it, but just don't necessarily have the tools. What you and I have been saying for a long time, since long before any of this was in the cultural conversation, was sex is the hardware, and including a bunch of pieces, and gender is the software, or I would say gender is the behavioral manifestations, right? And I think those two things apply somewhat less well in different particular situations. So, woman refers to sex, but you can act, womanly or feminine, or turn that into an adjective, and say, well, now we're talking about ways that historically, traditionally, stereotypically, if you like, women have tended to act. Actual women who would do or did or will or would produce eggs, right? But for genetic or developmental anomalies, women have tended to act in ways that are more nurturing. Women have tended to be more interested in people and animals than in things or systems. Not all women, not all men aren't interested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have to make those caveats all the time, or at least we shouldn't have to. But we have these two different words, and as much as it seems very confusing right now, it is useful to have those two different words. Sex refers to what the genetics handed us, and gender is all of the downstream effects, some of which are much more variable. But we only have one word for father. Mm-hmm. And so part of what we're running into then is almost the inverse of the problem that we're having with sex and gender. Like, maybe we want two words. I don't think we actually do, precisely because the genetic contribution to fatherhood isn't that big a deal compared to all of the other things that good fathers do. So
I have a thought experiment I use to pressure test this to see whether I actually believe it. And it works like this. Suppose I found, so Zach is sitting here.
Yes, he is. You're his father.
I am his father. Let's suppose that I was not his genetic father and that I just discovered that. Now, this runs into an immediate complication, right? Obviously, if your spouse cheats on you and that's how you end up raising somebody else's genetic product as your own offspring, then the breach of trust in the relationship is so gargantuan that it's hard to separate out your emotions about the kid.
Yeah.
But let's say it was a switched at birth.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
And just say, just in case you guys are wondering this is autobiographical at all, the six of us, your parents, my mother, you and I, and Zachary were sitting at dinner last night before we went to Zach's graduation. And Zachary embarked on some stories about how he had gotten through school and how he had driven and how he had managed to obtain some vehicles legally, but by stretching boundaries and pushing limits. And I also stretch boundaries and push limits, but every single thing about the way that he was talking, the way his mind was clearly moving, and his facial expressions. And I looked at you and your two parents and said, I know you didn't wonder, but if you ever did wonder, now you should have no doubt as to the paternity of this
All right.
child.
Well, I hate to do this so publicly, but what I never say in these circumstances, but always think is, well, I was the parent who raised him,
I know.
so you would expect that these things would be that way, whether or not. I mean, there could be a genetic component.
Even though there was pressure from both of us for him not to do some of those things.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
No.
Like, don't follow down your father's footsteps here. That's just no one to trouble.
Not
Zachary.
Not terribly surprised. But okay, the pressure test, though.
Yes.
Let's say it was a switched at birth at the hospital thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that you and I both discover he's not actually our kid,
Mm-hmm.
right? Does it change how I feel about him? Not in the slightest. Not in the slightest.
What if you discovered it 2 days later?
Well, 2 days later,
Yeah.
you reverse the thing. Right. But at this point, he's my kid,
Yep.
whether or not he's my genetic kid. And here's the place where the pressure test doesn't 100% work.
Okay.
Am I indifferent to the kid that was our genetic kid that got swapped out at the hospital and we've never met him?
I'm curious.
I'm curious.
Yeah.
Right?
What's he like?
I'm curious, and I might even feel affection towards him. But no, I'm this guy's father,
Mm-hmm.
one way or the other, genetically speaking, right? And that becomes
Biologically speaking. One way or the other, biologically speaking.
no, one way or the other, genetically speaking. Whether he's my
What do you
genetic kid or not my genetic kid, my feeling about him is the same, and my role as his father is the same, right? That's not to say that genes don't play some role, that there aren't some surprising heritable characteristics, but by and large, they have been greatly overrated compared to the huge range of things that an actual father passes on to their kid that are not passed on. Look.
Like how to be a total pain in the ass?
Like how to be a total pain in the ass.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, you did that really well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How not to pass up a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity at a pun, no matter how inappropriate it is to make it at that moment.
Yep.
I guess that's sort of a subsidiary lesson of how to be a pain in the ass.
But that is the,
yeah. But
how not to think hierarchically. No, actually, Zach does that really well.
He does that best.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a subtle, not very funny joke, although I enjoyed it. Anyway, so I think we've more or less arrived at the point, which is let's fix our damn terminology and let's, you're right. Motherhood clears this up because it is so very rare that there is any, ambiguity by virtue of the intensity of the relationship formed by pregnancy and lactation.
Well, I mean, there are plenty of mothers who aren't genetic mothers, but it is a rarer phenomenon.
Right. It's a rarer phenomenon, and anyway, we could do better terminology-wise, and I hope that, especially, I would almost think that the courts should start by fixing this, and that the culture can catch up.